Daniel Boone is America's pioneer hero. His life and times have been written about and portrayed for generations. As America commemorates the 250th anniversary of its founding era, the life of Daniel Boone serves as a window into the events which became the history of America, becoming a nation. The story you are about to hear is but one outstanding episode from Daniel Boone's remarkable life of nearly 86 years, during which he left footprints across lands which became 11 eastern states. You can engage with all those episodes and follow his footprints today through the second edition of the award-winning book In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone. Through engaging storytelling and 330 photographs captured at historical reenactments during the last 20 years, this book also puts Boone's life on the landscape and takes you back in time by taking you to the places where history happened. America's first westward movement began on the eve of the American Revolution. Please enjoy this episode of Boone's America, Boone Trace, 1775. In the winter of 1775, when Daniel was 41 and his wife Rebecca 36, Boone's America was still in turmoil. Daniel and Rebecca's oldest child, James, age 15, and another lad of the same age, Henry Russell, had been murdered in October 1773 as the family first attempted to move into the wilds of Kentucky. They were leaving the upper Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina, where Daniel had lived for 21 years, and he with Rebecca and their children since their marriage there in 1756. The westering Boone family did not make it even to Cumberland Gap before this tragedy struck. They had sold their land in North Carolina, and then at James' death they halted their migration. They were landless people hunkering down in southwest Virginia, in today's Scott County, still some 60 miles east of Cumberland Gap. The Boones were there during the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor in December 1773, the Revolutionary Act which only became known as the Boston Tea Party 2 generations later. By any name, that protest must have seemed a distant issue of no consequence to the Boones, following by only 2 months the loss of a child. They were there during Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, which most certainly did affect their lives and the lives of others on the frontier, as revenge-seeking warriors of native Mingos and Shawnees swept through the region, attacking outlying settlers, sweeping down through today's West Virginia and into today's northeast Tennessee. And during that time, Daniel had made a name for himself, in part, by riding into Kentucky to warn surveyors there of that Mingo and Shawnee uprising. Daniel Boone and Michael Stoner covered 800 miles in 61 days, going as far as the Falls of the Ohio, today's Louisville, before turning around and coming back by another route to pass again through the Cumberland Gap. In grateful recognition of that heroic effort, Daniel Boone was given a commission by Royal Governor Lord Dunmore as a captain in the Virginia militia. And in August and September of 1774, Boone was then leading militia companies at several forts along the Clinch River to protect families from the marauding Mingos, those avenging the murder of Chief John Logan's family at Yellow Creek on the prior April 30th, the Yellow Creek Massacre, an ambush by suspecting white settlers of Mingos who had come to the settlement in peace, a tragedy precipitated by anger, mistrust, and alcohol. It was the inciting event for Lord Dunmore's War. All that experience over those 2 years made Daniel Boone the ideal person Colonel Richard Henderson needed for what he had in mind. Such would have been the case even if Boone and Henderson had not been long acquainted already. Henderson was a land speculator and a prominent judge in Hillsborough, North Carolina. He was scheming to create and settle a new royal colony, this one in the Trans-Appalachian wilds of Kentucky. He and others, including brothers Nathaniel Hart and Thomas Hart, had fashioned a plan to make themselves lords proprietors of a new British colony. They had been working on this for some time with Henderson, a man long fascinated with the opportunity of the western lands. But Boone and Henderson were well acquainted already through the courts in Salisbury, with Henderson sometimes suing Boone, sometimes defending him. And indeed, by some accounts, Henderson had financed Daniel Boone to explore the Kentucky wilderness during his first expedition through the Cumberland Gap 5 years earlier in 1769. And what an adventure that was across 2 years, with Boone returning in spring 1771 with grand stories to tell of a magnificent land, well watered, and with open meadows and deep mature forest, rich in fish and game with deer, beaver, otter, elk, bison. It was a hunter's paradise. Meanwhile, back in North Carolina, in that same spring, 1771, Royal Governor William Tryon was marching into Hillsborough and then beyond to scatter regulators at Alamance. These good North Carolina citizens of the backcountry had been asking their colonial government, then dominated by the wealthy planters in the coastal plains and merchants in the ports, to do the right thing and to make the government work for them and not just for the politically connected. These regulators had been protesting for years and rioting since 1768, demanding better government. In response, William Tryon marched his army of North Carolina militiamen against their fellow citizens around Hillsborough, and then marched through the countryside and into the eastern Yadkin River Valley, burning crops and farms, confiscating cattle, arresting suspects, and finally returning to Hillsborough to put men on trial for treason before a judge. Guess who? Richard Henderson. 6 North Carolina citizens were hanged on June 19, 1771. But Daniel Boone had been in Kentucky hunting for 2 years. He was not involved in the War of the Regulation. He was not thinking about back east. He was looking west. And as excited as Daniel Boone was in spring 1771 for the adventure of Kentucky, Henderson was not yet ready to launch his new royal colony. He first had to complete his judgeship. So Daniel Boone went back to Kentucky in 1772, and by 1773 had decided that he could no longer wait for whatever it was Henderson was planning to do. Boone did not want to miss out on Kentucky. That's when he made his own move in fall 1773, the migration attempt that ended in the tragic death of his son, James. But by the winter of 1775, Richard Henderson was finished with his tenure as a judge. He and his Transylvania Company co-founders and officers, all in Hillsborough, had decided on a plan, and they hired Daniel Boone to gather together all the headmen of the Cherokee Nation at Sycamore Shoals, today's Elizabethton, Tennessee, so that their man, Thomas Hart, could negotiate a land deal for the Transylvania Company. That was step one. But not everyone was on board with the treaty, and Chief Dragging Canoe, the firebrand son of Cherokee Peace Chief Attackalackula, declared this would be a dark and bloody ground. Even before that treaty was over, Boone was already on step two. He and a party of road cutters, also called axemen, gathered at the Long Island of the Holston River in today's Kingsport, Tennessee on March 10, 1775, to begin marking a path for Henderson and others to follow. This would be the trail that brought land-hungry colonists from the east into the new land of opportunity. At least it was that from the settlers' perspective. This trail was Boone Trace. We talk about Daniel Boone and the 30 axemen who marked this trail, but 2 women went along, Dolly and Susanna. They were camp keepers, cooking for all the men. Dolly was a black woman enslaved by Richard Calloway, one of the road cutters, so she did not have a choice. Susanna was there because she was on her honeymoon, having married Will Hayes, age 20, one of the road cutters. Susanna was 14 and a half. She was Daniel and Rebecca's oldest daughter. After departing from the long island of the Holston, the road cutters were joined by some fellows from Tryon County, North Carolina, soon to be renamed Rutherford. These fellows, riding with Captain William Twitty, had caught up with Boone and wanted to get in on earning some land in Kentucky by helping mark this path. The route Boone followed from the long island of the Holston through southwest Virginia was a route he had followed during his earlier long hunter excursions, notably in 1769, when Boone made his first excursion to find this gap in the mountains. The portion of Boone Trace east of the Cumberland Gap lies in the extreme southwest corner of Virginia, in the two westernmost counties, Scott and Lee. The gap had been known to some Virginians for 20 years, but such a passage was still a rumor to most people. Boone had made that 1769 excursion at the encouragement of John Finley, who said he thought he knew a way to get into Kentucky through the mountains. Finley had been a trader with the Shawnees in Kentucky by coming down the Ohio River. Finley and Boone had met in 1755, serving together as civilian wagoners during Boone's involvement in the French and Indian War in western Pennsylvania when he was 20 years old. These two were among others hired by the British expedition under General Braddock to reclaim Fort Duquesne from the French. As the wagoners sat around the campfire each night, Finley had told stories about this wondrous land across the mountains, Kentucky. And for 14 years, Daniel Boone had dreamed of one day hunting in that hunter's paradise. And he did so for 2 years, after first passing through the Cumberland Gap in 1769. Another episode in Boone's America, and in the footsteps of Daniel Boone. In early 1775, January and February, John Anderson was starting to build his blockhouse near a crossing point on the Holston River as a gathering spot for travelers who would wait there until they had a large enough party with enough guns to provide themselves with protection, venturing toward the Cumberland Gap through southwest Virginia and then on into Kentucky. A replica of the Anderson blockhouse is in Natural Tunnels State Park, where volunteer members of the Daniel Boone Wilderness Trail Association provide interpretive programming. The Daniel Boone Wilderness Trail Interpretive Center is nearby in Duffield, Virginia. It overlooks Cane Gap, the last gap to cross before heading toward Cumberland Gap, still 60 miles away. Cane Gap is the last gap James Boone crossed before he made camp on the night of October 9th, 1773. And was killed along Wallen Creek before the next dawn. As Boone and the axemen passed through the Powell River Valley, they arrived at Martin's Station, an outpost created by Joseph Martin at the behest of Richard Henderson as a supply station for people venturing west into his new proposed royal colony. Boone and his road cutters moved west from Martin's Station with no wagon road available. It was pack horses only from there on into Kentucky. Boone and his party of road cutters approached the Cumberland Gap from the east, taking in the magnificence of this mountain face in the Cumberland Mountains, this breach, this welcome passage through this barrier range. These 30 road cutters were not building a road, but just clearing a pack horse trail, foot traffic only, no wagons for others to follow. The names can get confusing, but Boone Trace was not the Wilderness Road. The Wilderness Road was built for wagons in 1796 under a contract from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, a contract that went to other people, not Daniel Boone. And that road went to a different place, Crab Orchard. That's the blue line. Boone Trace, that's the red line, would go north to what would become Boonesborough, if they could get there. The party of adventurers passed through the gap and made their way confidently north along Yellow Creek to the Cumberland River, passing along the water gap through the Pine Mountains. They crossed the river at Cumberland Ford and made their way toward Flat Lick. To this point, beyond Cumberland Gap, Boone had been following the Great Warrior's Path. This was an ancient route created over millennia by migrating herds of buffalo, deer, elk, and followed by war parties and trading parties of different tribes, even the earlier people, the Yuchi, who were run off by the Cherokees and Shawnees. Boone's party continued into today's Knox County to arrive at Flat Lick. From there, Boone diverged his new path from the Warrior's Path, and from this same juncture, the later Wilderness Road would also diverge in yet a third direction. Flat Lick became a major point of decision for many travelers, as well as a point of convergence for those headed to Cumberland Gap. This junction of paths is commemorated with numerous monuments and plaques, with one declaring of Boone Trace, without exaggeration, "No other trail is of greater historical significance to the founding of Kentucky or the opening of the West." Indeed, in 1775, Daniel Boone was marking that little road. Boone's party marked its new route to the north and west, passing to the east of today's Barberville, site of the oldest Daniel Boone Festival in Kentucky since 1948. Farther along, Boone chose a route followed today by US 25 to the east of today's Corbin. Along that route near London into today's Laurel County is Levi Jackson Wilderness Road Park, formerly a state park. It includes a remnant of the original Boone Trace. Looking at the modern setting, it is hard to remember that for Boone and his road cutters in 1775, they were in a primeval wilderness forest, blazing trees with notches for others to follow. Boone continued northward, marking a route to another junction, Hazel Patch. From that spot, another primitive hunter's trail, known as Skaggs Trace, led west and northwest. Hazel Patch was the site in 1793 of Wood's Blockhouse, one of the first permanent buildings in Kentucky. But in 1775, Hazel Patch was just that, a patch of meadow with hazel trees providing a bounty of nutritious hazelnuts for travelers to feast on. From Hazel Patch, Boone's party of axemen marked their trail northward to leave modern Laurel County as they crossed the Rockcastle River well east of today's Livingston. They followed creeks upstream and emerged onto ridge lines, then descended down other creeks through land which remains today rugged and wild. A remnant of the original Boone Trace in this area is preserved today by the membership-supported Friends of Boone Trace. Boone's party arrived at today's Orlando, then Wildey, following Roundstone Creek north to its headwaters. In its headwaters, they crossed the ridge line that took them from the Cumberland River Basin into the watershed of Kentucky River on Red Lick Creek. That passage is called Boone Gap, which is today the county line between Rockcastle and Madison counties. That prominent passage is commemorated today in a pull-off from US 25 with historic markers and a cast-iron tablet placed in 1915 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. From Boone Gap, the road cutters proceeded a dozen miles north to today's Berea, Kentucky, where visitors will find another DAR marker across from historic Boone Tavern, a name which fools a lot of out-of-staters because the tavern is not of Daniel Boone's era or involvement. The hotel is historic for other reasons. Having left Long Island of the Holston on March 10, Boone and his axemen were 2 weeks into the trail marking effort. Their party continued north across the plateau, arriving on March 24th at a spot just west of today's Bluegrass Army Depot and south of today's Richmond. They made camp there, only a day away from their goal of reaching the Big Lick on the Kentucky River, a place Daniel Boone had identified during his previous visits as a good place for a town. What happened next is best shared in a passage from the book, In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone. Marking the road to the site for Richard Henderson's settlement in 1775 was hard work, but it proceeded without incident until they were only 15 miles from the intended destination of Big Lick on the Kentucky River. Just before dawn on March 25th, The party of axemen who had left the long island of the Holston with Boone in the mid-March were camped near the head of Taylor's Fork of Silver Creek. Since no watch had been posted, a party of Shawnee was able to stalk the campsite unnoticed. Only when the attack began were the axemen roused from their sleep by a burst of war whoops and shots fired. During the first volley, Captain William Twitty was shot through both knees. His enslaved manservant, name unknown, jumped up but was shot and fell instantly dead into the campfire. Boone and his able-bodied men scattered into the forest with their guns. Some, including Squire Boone, wore little, if any, clothing. Crouching behind a tree, Squire quickly realized that in his hurried escape he had grabbed his jacket instead of his kit of powder and shot. He called out in a whisper for Daniel, who made his way over to resupply his brother. Meanwhile, the attackers rushed into the camp to scout Twitty and the other wounded. Twitty's faithful bulldog would have none of that. The defender lunged at the attacker, seizing one of the Shawnees by the throat. Another attacker tomahawked the dog to rescue his companion. The two warriors then fled the camp. The men reloaded their long guns, listening closely for any sign of the attackers. They advanced into their camp, rifles at the ready, to discover that the Shawnees had left without taking any of the baggage. Twitty was alive but unconscious. He had little hope of recovery, but he retained his scalp. Felix Walker, severely wounded and believed to be dying, was the other casualty of the raid. At dawn, the men hastily erected 3 small cabins only 4 or 5 feet in height. They did not attempt to stockade this fortification for further protection. On the 3rd day, Captain Twitty died of his wounds. He was buried at the site of the attack, and the camp was thus dubbed Twitty's Fort. Felix Walker was unable to be moved, so the party remained there for days, tending to him and preparing for the continuation of the expedition. Both Captain Twitty and Felix Walker were part of that group from Tryon County, North Carolina. Boone and his men remained at the site tending to Felix Walker, while also scouting around for food and to assure that they would not be attacked again. Days went by. On April 1st, a week after the attack, Boone wrote a message and sent it back to Henderson, who was advancing along the trail Boone was marking, perhaps a week behind him still. On April 7th, Henderson, not yet through the Cumberland Gap, received the message Boone had sent 6 days before. Boone advised Henderson to hurry forward as the people with him were getting uneasy. Boone wrote, "Now is the time to flusterate the intentions of the Indians and keep the country whilst we are in it. If we give way to them now, it will ever be the case." The Shawnees had attacked other parties of settlers venturing into Kentucky. Those attacked and others thus frightened had turned back and were retreating in haste through the Cumberland Gap. The next day, April 8th, Henderson was heading west toward Cumberland Gap and was shocked to see party after party of would-be settlers pouring east through the Gap, leaving Kentucky. Some of his own party turned around with them. Henderson wrote in his journal, "Every person almost that we met seemed to be at pains to aggravate the danger of proceeding, and had we given them all a fair hearing, I believe they would, in return for this favor, have gotten all our men." Fearing that he might soon see Boone and his party among those returning, when Henderson reached Cumberland Ford, he asked for volunteers to ride ahead to let Boone know they were coming, and to reinforce Boone's party of men. No one stepped forth. After adding the promise of 10,000 acres of Transylvania land as part of the offer, a young William Cock volunteered. On the morning of April 10, he was outfitted with a Queen Anne's musket, ammunition, a tomahawk, a Dutch blanket, and a generous supply of jerked beef. Henderson wrote in his journal, Mr. Cock started from Cumberland Gap about 130 miles from the place and carried with him, besides his own enormous load of fearful apprehensions, a considerable burden of my own uneasiness. While Henderson and his party were anxiously making their way north, Felix Walker had recovered enough to be moved. Boone devised a sling between two horses to carry him, and the road cutters proceeded 15 miles following along Otter Creek to arrive at Sycamore Hollow, probably around April 6th. They began erecting small cabins there near two springs, one fresh and one brackish, the second offering a source of salt they would need on the frontier. But when Henderson arrived 10 days later, he drew up plans for a larger fort on higher ground in a spot he thought less likely to flood than the hollow Boone had chosen. The road cutters had already deemed this settlement Fort Boone, but Henderson changed the name to Boonesborough, which seemed likely to invite settlers rather than fighters, he thought, though he surely must have known plenty of both would be needed to hold this land. It was only a frontier for the new arrivers intending to claim it as their own. To those who used it for hunting, as they had for generations, it was their homeland. Thus continued the tensions between two cultures, which would define the contours of what this new land, this Kentucky, would become. And 3 days later, unknown to these intrepid pioneers on the western edge of the British-American colonies, Paul Revere made his famous late-night ride, and the shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. America's first westward movement and the American Revolution would intertwine, as they did in the molding of a new nation. The marking of Boone Trace in 1775 is one of the stories that made Daniel Boone famous. During 2025, we observe the 250th anniversary of that little road, the trail he marked from the outpost of an American colony confined and restrained to the eastern slopes and plains of its original vision, then through the Cumberland Gap into the possibilities of the wilderness of Kentucky, the beginning of America's first westward movement, for better and for worse, hand in hand with the American Revolution. You can join in the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of Boone Trace during 2025 by participating in several planned events, including a relay hike along historic Boone Trace beginning April 23rd in Kingsport, Tennessee, and covering in daily walking segments the 200 miles across southwest Virginia through the Cumberland Gap, and then on to the 2-day grand commemoration event on June 7 and 8 at Fort Boonesborough State Park. That event is hosted by the Fort Boonesborough Foundation. Learn more about the event at fortboonesboroughfoundation.org. Come join us in the 250th anniversary celebration of Boone Trace in Fort Boonesborough. For information about the Boone Trace commemoration hike and events organized by Cumberland Gap Trail Alliance in cooperation with historical venues and events you'll find all along that hike, visit BooneTrace250.com. To become a sustaining member of Friends of Boone Trace, Keepers of That Little Road, visit BooneTrace1775.com. To purchase copies of the just-released second edition of the award-winning book In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone, check with your local historical society or some of the historical venues involved with the Boone Trace commemoration, or ask your local independent bookstore to get it for you. Autographed copies are available from the author. Visit DanielBooneFootsteps.com. This video is a production of Daniel Boone Footsteps Publishing in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The book's author and producer of this video, Randall Jones, is grateful to all the reenactors who have shared their historical interpretations during the last 20 years. If you enjoyed this video, you will love the book, and through it you will also enjoy exploring Boone's America by following in his footsteps. Thank you for watching. Tell your friends. Spread the word. Huzzah!